The sun hung high over the penitentiary, its brutal light bouncing off the razor wire and casting long shadows across the exercise yard. Malcolm Hayes, a towering black man in his late 40s, moved through the crowd like a ghost, his deep-set brown eyes betraying no emotion. Dressed in the standard orange jumpsuit, he kept to himself, his broad shoulders and disciplined posture marking him as different from the usual inmates. Nobody knew much about Malcolm. He'd been processed quietly, entered general population without protest, and never spoke unless spoken to. He didn't engage in prison politics, never joined a gang, and ignored the constant racial tensions that plagued the yard. But in a place where respect was earned through violence, silence was often mistaken for weakness. Across the yard, a gang of white supremacists known as the Iron Vultures had been watching him for weeks. Their leader, a tattooed brute named Kane Bloodhound Vickers, saw Malcolm as an easy target, a loner, a nobody. And in prison, a black man standing alone was a man without protection. The attack was planned for the afternoon yard session. 5 men surrounded Malcolm near the weight benches, their tattoos broadcasting their affiliations, swastikas, iron crosses, and lightning bolts marking them as the worst kind of predators. "Yo, fresh meat," Kane sneered, stepping forward. "You been real quiet since you got here. See? That don't work in our house." Malcolm didn't react. He merely glanced at Kane, as if assessing his weight, height, and possible weaknesses in a single casual look. Kane mistook the silence for fear. "Ain't no free rides in here, boy. You pay rent to walk through our yard." He shoved Malcolm's chest, testing him. Still, Malcolm didn't move. The second shove came harder, followed by laughter from the gang. Then, without warning, Malcolm's hands shot forward like striking vipers. He grabbed Kane's wrist, twisted, and a sickening pop echoed through the yard. Kane howled, his arm bending at an unnatural angle as he dropped to his knees. The laughter stopped. A second gang member lunged, a shank glinting in his hand. Malcolm sidestepped fluidly, grabbed the man's wrist, and redirected the momentum, slam, driving the attacker face first into the pavement. Blood splattered. 3 men remained. The yard went silent. Guards stood frozen behind the fences, unsure whether to intervene or watch. The next attacker swung a makeshift club. Malcolm ducked, his movements impossibly smooth for a man his size, and countered with a brutal elbow to the ribs, followed by a knee to the sternum. The man crumpled. 2 left. One of them pulled a razor blade from his sleeve. Malcolm exhaled, his stance shifting slightly. For the first time, his eyes darkened, not with fear, but with something much worse. Cold calculation. The blade-wielding man lunged, slashing wildly. Malcolm pivoted at the last second, catching the attacker's wrist and twisting it until the blade fell. In the same motion, he wrapped an arm around the man's throat and squeezed. Seconds later, the inmate dropped, unconscious before he even hit the ground. The final gang member bolted. Malcolm let him go. Kane was still on the ground, groaning in pain, his gang shattered around him. Malcolm wiped a drop of blood from his knuckles and turned to face the yard. The other inmates, black, Latino, and even a few white prisoners, stared in stunned silence. Then someone whispered, "Delta Force." The word sent a shockwave through the crowd. Whispers turned into murmurs. Someone else repeated it, then another. Delta Force. It wasn't just a rumor. It was fact. Malcolm Hayes wasn't an ordinary man. He was a former Delta Force operative, a legend among the military elite. A man trained in every form of combat, survival, and warfare. The kind of soldier the government sent when things went wrong, and when no one else could fix it. And somehow he had ended up in prison. High above the yard, Warden Eric Dawes leaned forward in his office chair, staring at the security footage. He knew Malcolm's file was sealed, knew the government had buried something deep. And now, watching the chaos unfold on screen, he finally understood why. Malcolm Hayes wasn't just dangerous. He was the most dangerous man in this prison. And the real trouble had only just begun. The yard was dead silent. Every inmate, every guard, even the ones watching from the towers had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. Malcolm Hayes had taken down a gang of hardened criminals like they were untrained street thugs. Kane lay groaning on the pavement, his wrist twisted at an unnatural angle. The other gang members were either unconscious or too broken to fight. No one had ever seen anything like it. And then the whispers started again. Delta Force. In a place where strength ruled, word spread fast. The gangs, the lifers, even the prison guards, everyone suddenly realized that Malcolm wasn't just some quiet nobody. He was something else entirely. Something lethal. 2 guards stormed into the yard, batons drawn. "Get down, hands behind your head now," one barked. Malcolm slowly complied, lowering himself to his knees, his hands interlocking behind his head. He had no intention of resisting. He had made his statement. There was nothing left to prove. Kane, still writhing in pain, spat blood on the pavement. He broke my damn arm," he gasped. The guards glanced at the carnage around them. They had seen prison fights before, but this wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Another guard ran up, speaking into his radio. "We need medical in the yard now, and get Warden Dawes." Malcolm stayed still as they restrained him, but even as his wrists were cuffed, the guards' hands trembled. They were afraid of him. 30 minutes later, Malcolm sat in a cold interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. The door creaked open and Warden Dawes stepped inside. A tall, weathered man with gray hair and sharp blue eyes. He was no stranger to dealing with dangerous inmates. But Malcolm wasn't just another criminal. Dawes pulled out a chair and sat across from him. He didn't say anything at first, just studied Malcolm like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Finally, he spoke. "Who are you?" Malcolm didn't answer. He simply stared back. Dawes sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I know your file is classified. I know you didn't belong in general population. And now, half the prison thinks they just saw a ghost from a war zone." He paused. "So let's get something straight. You keep doing things like that, and you're going to start a riot." Malcolm's voice was calm, controlled. "I didn't start it." Dawes smirked. But you finished it, and now the whole prison's watching you." He tapped his fingers on the table. "That's a problem." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "For who?" Dawes chuckled. "For everyone. The Aryans aren't going to let this slide. The black gangs might try to recruit you. The guards, half of them are ex-military, and they're wondering why a guy like you is even here." Malcolm leaned forward slightly. "So what do you want from me?" Dawes studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Solitary." Malcolm's jaw tightened. Solitary confinement wasn't for punishment. It was for protection, or more likely, control. Dawes stood, placing his hands on the table. "You're a walking war machine, Hayes. I don't know what you did to end up here, and frankly, I don't care, but I know men like you don't break easily. So I'll make this simple." He leaned in. "Stay in line, and I might be able to keep you alive." Malcolm met his gaze without flinching. "I don't need protection." Dawes smirked. But the rest of the prison does." That night, Malcolm sat in his isolated cell, listening. It started with distant shouts. Then the unmistakable sounds of boots slamming against doors. A riot. And Malcolm knew exactly who it was for. The Iron Vultures were out for blood. Sirens blared as the prison went into lockdown, but it was too late. The riot had begun. The door to his cell burst open. 3 masked inmates rushed in, makeshift knives flashing under the dim lights. Malcolm moved before they could react. The first man swung wildly, too slow. Malcolm caught his wrist, twisted, and snap. The bone shattered. The second lunged, aiming for Malcolm's throat. A miscalculation. Malcolm sidestepped, drove his knee into the attacker's ribs, and sent him crashing into the steel bed frame. The third hesitated. Malcolm didn't. One punch, one brutal, precise strike. The man collapsed instantly. More footsteps echoed down the hall. More attackers were coming. Malcolm exhaled. If they wanted a war, he would give them one. By the time the guards regained control, the riot was over, and Malcolm Hayes was still standing. His cell was littered with unconscious bodies. Dawes arrived minutes later, surveying the scene. He shook his head, half in disbelief, half in frustration. "This was a mistake," he muttered. Malcolm looked at him. "Keeping me here was your mistake." Dawes sighed. "I figured as much." He turned to the guards. Get him out of here. 2 days later, Malcolm was gone, transferred. Some said the government took him back. Others believed he escaped. But one thing was certain. No one in that prison would ever forget the day they saw the legend in chains.